All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started back on the disinfection byproducts. Whereas before lunch, Bessie discussed the formation of them, the regulations relating to them. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the sample collection on them. Since we already talked about what they are, the trihalomethanes, the haloacetic acids, I'm not gonna spend much time going over that again, but just remember, it's the formation caused by excessive chlorine combining with your organic matter, which is why it's most common in surface water, but as we found out here in Louisiana, you've got quite a bit of a problem with it getting into your groundwater also. Yeah, keep in mind that a lot of this stuff was written generically to fit all 50 states, and each state was allowed to tailor to fit their specific needs. So some of the stuff we talk about won't necessarily be in the book, and I'll say it up front. I apologize if I talk about Texas too much. That's where I've got all my experience from, so I'll use a lot of Texas references. Please don't hold that against me. Hold on. I'm still getting used to this clicker. All right, just as with your back T samples, you're gonna find out that the sample collection for your disinfection byproduct samples, it's a very similar process. You have rules and regulations that regulate where you can collect your samples. You can't just at random decide you're gonna throw a dart at the map and say, this is where I want to collect my sample, or say, I'm going to collect sample here because I don't think I'll find anything here, so that way I don't have to do anything. If you want to find out the specifics, you can go to the Code of Federal Regulations. We're not going to go into that because I don't want to put everybody to sleep right after lunch. But just know that you can go to the Chapter 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It'll have all the details you could possibly want and then some. Now, the one thing that I will say is they have to be collected from the distribution sample. From the distribution system. Any idea why you wouldn't just collect it at your plant? Correct. Exactly. I don't know if everybody could hear what, I can't see your name tag. Okay, Mr. Alexandria, who doesn't want to be known. Hey, he's not charging for autographs, so he can't be Johnny. All right. I wasn't going to go there. All right. As he was saying, it's because disinfection byproducts take time to form. So out in your distribution system, after they've had a chance to interact with your chlorine and your organics, that's when you're actually going to find them. If you take your samples at your plant, you're not getting an accurate representation of what's actually forming. And obviously, we don't want to find a problem, but if it's there, we do want to know it's there. All right, as I found out yesterday, I was corrected by somebody yesterday. Apparently, this is not the type of sample bottles that you use here, or at least that's not what somebody used yesterday, and they told me that this was wrong. These specific were written for a generic of this is the most common setup for collecting samples. Generally, you'll have two 40 milliliter vials, two 2 milliliter vials, and one 250 milliliter vial. Now, some systems we found have gone to collecting just a larger sample and then letting the lab split it up as they need it. But the benefit of having the multiple bottles is we all know during transportation, samples tend to get broken, they get lost, they leak. That way, by having the multiple bottles, that way if one of them doesn't make it there, you still potentially have enough water to get your analysis done. Also, if you do have the multiple bottles like this, that doesn't mean to get partial samples at multiple locations. It all needs to be collected at one location. Because what the lab is doing, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know we've got a couple of lab people back there, they actually only need a small portion of this water. It's extra in case they have to rerun it or anything. I'm getting some positive head nods back there. So I'm not giving you too much bad information yet. All right, just like with the back T samples, you want to collect from some place where you've got a good, clean connection. Like I said, preferably a smooth sample tap outside the residence, because you want to get a representation of what you're actually putting out in the system, not what the customer's done with their plumbing, you know, what 1910 plumbing they still have in their house, or like my house, 1970 galvanized pipe that's tuberculated down to about 1/3 of an inch. So, but if you do have to collect it off of the person's plumbing, try to find one that doesn't have an aerator, or if there is an aerator, take it off. You know, look for the point that's going to give you the most accurate representation of what's actually out in your system. Again, and this can be very repetitive of the back T sampling because it's a very similar process. To make sure that you're getting a representation of what's in the line, not what's sitting in that meter run or the customer's plumbing, let it run for a couple minutes. You can also put a temperature gauge in there, a thermometer, and check and see when you see a noticeable temperature change. That'll let you know that you're actually getting water from your system, from that distribution pipe, versus what's sitting in that collection, or not the collection, the meter run. You know, reduce your flow down to a pencil-sized stream so you get a clean sample. And never let your bottles touch the tap, or your fingers touch the inside of the bottle. Anything that could potentially contaminate that sample. Like I said, and this is, if you're using this method where you're collecting multiple bottles, fill them immediately, one right after another from the same location. You know, don't say, well, I'll get half of them here, I'll go next door and get half in case they got some better water. Or I'll get half here and I'll fill the other half up with some bottled water so I make sure I pass. Don't trust bottled water. So, get it filled up and make sure, just like with the back T bottles, there is a preservative in that bottle. Except instead of sodium thiosulfate, it's ascorbic acid. So you don't want to rinse your bottles out. You know, they're prepared in advance, so you may not see anything. The ascorbic acid sometimes is a clear liquid or maybe a crystal. So it may not look like there's anything in there, but you don't want to rinse that bottle out because you're taking out that preservative. Once you fill it up, you add the red cap 2 milliliter vial into the larger vial. But again, this is if you're using this sample technique. Also, one of the most important things on your disinfection byproduct samples is they're volatile. The disinfection byproducts are volatile and they can be affected by the atmosphere. So you got to make sure that you don't have any air or oxygen, or as little as possible in that sample. So in order, whenever you do that, slowly fill the bottle all the way up till you see a meniscus. You see that little bubble of water on top. A technique we've started teaching some of our people to do is actually put a little water in the cap at the same time. You know, you got to get that art down. It's just like doing the whirly bags. Flip it together. Make sure you get as little air as possible in there. Once you're done, flip the bottle over, shake it, flip it, and see if you see any air. If you see some air, go ahead and top it off there before you leave, because once you get to the lab, what happens if the samples aren't full? Exactly. Then you just wasted your day collecting samples that the lab's not going to run. And it's already bad enough you're having to spend all this time collecting all these samples that you don't want to collect anyways. But what's worse? Spending all day collecting samples, or spending a couple days collecting samples, get to the lab and they say, we can't run these. So always check your samples before you leave the site, because you can top them off while you're there, but once you're gone, you got to start all over. And make sure your caps are tight, because that's another common problem we see. You know, people, they get in a hurry, they put the cap on, they don't check to make sure it's secure, throw it in the cooler. By the time they get to the lab, half their samples sitting in the bottom of the cooler. Something as simple as taking that extra second, making sure that cap's snug, save you a lot of time in the long run. Like I already talked about, you make sure that you don't have any air. Shake the bottle, flip it upside down, look for any air bubbles. we were told yesterday the rule of thumb here is no more than the thickness of a dime is acceptable. Is that? I'm getting some questionable looks from the lab over there.
We don't test the TPH here, and they say 5.
Oh, okay. She's just looking at me like that. She says, that sounds like some rule somebody just made up. That's what somebody told me yesterday. But general rule is you want no air if at all possible. But just keep it as, we know we don't live in a perfect world, so keep it as minimal as possible. Make sure all your samples are labeled. Because again, you spend all day collecting samples, you put all these samples in the bottle, you forget to label too. Once you get to the lab, don't all the bottles look alike? Kind of hard to figure out where you got them. That way, if you do find a problem, you know where to go back to. This just goes back over more of the next bottle, the 250 milliliter bottle. Again, same process, make sure it's full, make sure it's labeled. And something that I think a lot of people don't, well, I won't say a lot. What I have seen people do is they lose their marker during the day. They forget their marker. So they look around, they find something laying in their truck. It's not a waterproof marker. They write it on it, then they start handling these bottles with wet hands. What happens? Label's smeared, it's gone, it's unreadable. Same thing, you're right back in that same boat. You've spent all day collecting samples, you don't know where they came from. And if you can't identify where it came from, the state's not going to accept them, the lab's not going to accept them. You know, make sure you have the right waterproof marker. And if you are shipping, you said y'all don't do your own samples here, you ship them off somewhere? Okay. So make sure that you're packing them where they're going to be kept cold during that time. One thing to consider, if you're shipping it, they recommend that you do not ship on Thursdays or Fridays because a lot of times you may end up sitting at a carrier, FedEx, UPS, whoever you use. It ends up sitting in their warehouse over the weekend. And no matter how much dry ice you packed in that bag, come Monday when they finally put it on a truck, your samples may be no good anymore. Oh, just spoke about this. Also, make sure that you do pack your chain of custody form inside the box because if the lab gets a whole box of samples, there's no chain of custody, you're right back in that same boat again. I know it keeps coming back to this. You've spent all that time collecting samples, they don't know where they came from, they may not even know who they came from if you don't have that chain of custody in there. Also, put it inside a plastic bag, that way it doesn't get wet. That way in case you do have a sample bottle leak or anything in shipping, because we know the carriers they take utmost care of our packages. They don't throw them, you know. They don't chunk them over the fence or anything like that. You know, they don't stand on them, drop them. They'd never break a bottle. But just on the off chance that they do, pack that chain of custody inside a plastic bag. That way if it does leak in there, that chain of custody is still in good shape and readable when it gets to the lab. Any questions, comments, concerns about this process? Oops. One thing I forgot to mention before I get going on the next section, there were some questions about the worksheets for the samples earlier. It's on page 12.8 in the book if you're looking for it. All right, now we're going to move on to the distribution system. You know, what is the distribution system? Basically, that's everything outside your fence, from the time it leaves your plant to the time it goes to the customer's tap. So, upon completion of this module, you should be able to describe the common methods to deliver water to the public and identify some of the common components. Like I said, and this is all after treatment outside your fence. All right, first thing we wanted to talk about is your storage reservoirs. You know, any idea, what is a storage reservoir? It's that simple. It's the tank you put the water in after you're done with it, before you give it to the customers. Now they serve many purposes, like you mentioned, contact time. Also, it allows you to equalize demand on your system. This isn't really an issue you see with larger systems because they have to have tanks, but in some of your smaller systems, yes sir. There are some out there. They're not very common, but there are some. I think that varies state to state. I'm not sure about Louisiana. I do not know if they're still legal here. Anybody have an answer for that? Underground storage tanks, are they legal here? Yeah, I think it's a thing that even if they are still legal, I don't think they're very widely used. But like I was saying, some of your smaller systems, in order to save money, might say, well, why can't I just pump straight out of my well out into my distribution system? You know, have a kind of an on-demand system. When customer needs water, the well comes on and we'll just pump straight to them. I'm getting some head shaking back there. Exactly. You know, that may work whenever you have a low flow. You know, when you have a couple customers turn on their tap, that well may have no problem keeping up with it. It may be able to keep up with many customers at one time. But depending on the size of your well, most wells, even a very large well, might only produce 3,000 gallons a minute. And depending on the number of customers you've got, you could quickly outstrip that. Or in case of a fire or something, you start opening some fire hydrants, you have a large industrial customer, turns on a, you know, they're filling a tank or something. You quickly outstrip that.
You lose your contact time when you do that.
Exactly.
We got a tank just below the fire.
Say it again?
We got a tank just below the fire before we treat that water.
Really?
It goes
So,
to the fire.
so you have a separate system just for fire? Okay.
Then if you have a leak, you can determine, check the flow rate, whether it's fire with water or whether it's messy.
Yeah, it makes it really convenient, and it does help the guys that work out in the system. But I think very few people are employing that anymore because it's very expensive.
The well pumps off into that tank, then lift pumps it out that tank into the top.
Yeah. Like I said, there's a lot of benefits to having a dual system like that, but for most people it's just cost prohibitive. And then some locations, like, you know, I'm from Houston, we have so much stuff in the ground already that, you know, people are fighting for every inch of ground space they've got. You know, utility easements are so full that to say we want to add a separate line just for fire just won't happen. Okay. Yeah, some of your like business type customers where it's a very small system, you know, that's a pretty common thing. But as far as any municipalities, I have been told there still are some out there, but it's generally ones that built their systems a long time ago when it was a lot cheaper and there was a lot less stuff in the way. So during your times of low demand, like particularly, for most people that's at night, you know, but depending on some of your industrial situations, you may have industrial customers who draw a lot of water at night for cooling or, you know, various processes. But for your average municipality, nighttime, middle of the day are your low demand times. That morning period from say 6 to 9 and that evening from about 4 to 7 or 8, that's usually your high demand times. That's when everybody's taking showers or cooking dinner, washing clothes, things like that. Well, during that low demand time of night, that's when you take your opportunity to get your tanks filled. Fill them up, top them off for the next morning, that way they're ready to go. So whenever the demand does kick up, you can start drawing off of there. You're not trying to rely off of that well or your whatever process you have up to that point. You're not having your plant try to keep up with the demand. You're drawing off that reserve you've got. It allows you to have a uniform pumping rate because, if you're taking water straight out of a well, trying to put it into a booster pump, you're going to have ups and downs, spikes. You're just not going to get a consistent, good performance out of your pumps. On top of that, I don't think too many states would approve you to do that anyways. Like I talked about a little bit ago, it allows you to have that adequate water for firefighting because, you may not realize how much water one fire hydrant actually can take. And if you have a large fire and you have 2, 3 fire hydrants going or more, you could use a single 4.5-inch fire hydrant, at the right demand or at the right pressure, can put out 2,000 to 2,500 gallons a minute. And if you've got 2 fire hydrants going and you've got one 3,000 gallon a minute or 3,000 GPM well, you can take that tank down pretty quick. And as Burley mentioned earlier, his main concern is contact time for disinfection. Now, like I said, for the ground storage, there's a few different types. Sometimes you might hear them referred to as a clear well. Generally, if it's called a clear well, that's usually inside a surface water plant. It's just a difference of terminology. It could be the same tank. In a surface water plant, they'll call it a clear well. In a groundwater plant, they'll call it a ground storage tank or just a storage tank, or even just the tank. You can ignore that. That was written for Texas. But TCEQ is our version of your DHH. That's our regulatory agency that handles all things related to water. Handles our licensing, handles our permits for our plants, all of that. Now, like I said, some of these requirements were based off of Texas regulations because when we wrote this stuff, we knew we were going to have to take it across all 50 states, and these requirements can vary by state, but generally they're going to be very similar. Because most of this stuff is taken from EPA guidelines or AWWA guidelines, and so most states are going to have very similar. So if I say something and it doesn't apply to Louisiana, let me know. I don't want to give everybody wrong information. All tanks, any opening you have, such as vents, all must have screens on them. The purpose of those screens are to keep out animals, debris, anything that could potentially get in that tank and compromise the quality of it. I think somebody told me yesterday y'all require a 24 gauge screen or a 24 mesh screen, stainless steel. Well, based off of what I use in my facilities, we use I don't know the gauge or the mesh number, but it basically looks like a screen for a house, but it's heavy duty stainless steel. You put it around all your vents, it keeps out your animals, bugs. You'd be amazed what will go up one of those vents if you leave it open. Again, this is a Texas requirement, but I'm sure it's very similar here. You have to have less than a 1/16 gap at any overflow covers. For your entry points, that's something you might not think about. In order to get in that tank, we always talk about wanting to keep things out of the tank. But at some point, you're going to have to get into that tank to work on it. So you got to have certain entry point requirements. They have to be minimum sizes. You may have to have a minimum number. Generally, most tanks that I've dealt with, you have at least 2 access manways on the side and 1 on top. I'm getting some positive nod there. So is that similar here? Thank you. And again, this is a Texas requirement, probably very similar here. 200 gallons per connection per person. Now this can be a combination of both your ground storage tanks, elevated tanks, any type of storage tank you have in your facility. Now you can't do we tried this in Houston. We have a lot of very large distribution lines. We're talking, we've got, lines up to 96-inch diameter, and hundreds of miles of it. We thought we'd be smooth. We contacted the state and said, well, can we take some ground storage tanks that are in bad shape out of service, because we have the capacity if we count all these distribution lines. They laughed at us. So it's got to be something inside the plant. They said it can't be sitting out in your distribution system. It has to be physically within the plant, available on demand for, as needed. And like I said, I'm sure everybody here, or at least I'm assuming everybody here has seen a storage tank before, correct? They come in all different shapes, sizes, colors. You've got, some of them are concrete. For a while, that seemed to be the fad of going to the concrete because they didn't require painting. As we found out firsthand in my system, no matter how well they're built, they all leak. Plus they're very expensive to build. Costs you about 3 times the price to build it, so you got to weigh out the benefits of the different types of material. You must have primary roof access, not less than 30 inches. And like I said, that's to allow people to get inside the tank if you have to do any kind of repairs, any kind of work. Because if you don't have that 30-inch hatch, you will have to provide it during maintenance. And in order, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to have to cut a hatch in my tank each time I needed to do some work. It's better just to put the hatch in, secure it, put a door on it, put a flange on it, put something where you can easily get in and out of that tank if you need to do the work. Also, any type of material that you put in that tank as far as paint has to meet AWWA standards. Now what the AWWA will tell you, they'll say refer to the NSF. That is the National Sanitary, drawing a blank, but it's the NSF coding requirements. They will tell you what particular kinds of paints you can and cannot use. They have to be a food grade paint because it's obviously in contact with water. Also, based on the lead and copper rules, you cannot have any kind of lead fittings or solder inside your tanks, because lead and copper leach as it sits with time. And where does your water sit the longest usually? In your storage tanks. Like I said, any coatings you put on the tank have to be approved. You can't say, well, I've got some leftover paint from when we painted a pump earlier this year, or the guy down the street's got some leftover paint from when he painted his house. He said he'll give it to me. You can't do it, particularly on the inside of your tanks. You're not supposed to put it on the outside of your tank. Any coatings on that tank anywhere are supposed to be NSF approved, but they will definitely nail you if you try to put an unapproved coating inside that tank. It's got to be something that won't deteriorate, won't dissolve into your water, won't flake off, or put off any kind of contamination into the tank. Now, the next type of storage that we're going to talk about is the elevated storage. This is a picture of one here. They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. What a lot of cities I've seen have started doing is they start trying to decorate them, and that kind of is what their cities are known for. I've seen them painted as golf balls. There's actually one in Texas that for some reason they painted the whole thing bright pink. I guess that way they'll be known as the city that's got the bright pink water tower. You're coming down the highway, you can't miss them. I even seen one that was painted as a fishbowl, and they had a giant goldfish painted on the side of the tank. Now, the purpose of them is to help maintain your water pressure in your system. They do this by simply sitting on top of your system and allowing gravity, the force of the gravity, to push down on that system and provide a consistent, even pressure. For every 1 foot of water you have in that tank, it exerts 0.433 pounds of pressure. And again, this is a Texas requirement. I'm not sure what the exact requirement for Louisiana is, but I'm sure it's very similar. If your system has more than 2,500 connections, you must have at least one elevated storage tank in Texas. Anybody know what the requirement here is? Again, I'm sure it's very similar, but don't quote me on that. Since they're basically a ground storage tank that's up on stilts, you still have to meet any requirements you have to meet for a ground storage tank, you also have to meet on your elevated storage tanks. As far as your coatings, your disinfection requirements, your inspections, everything like that, same thing applies to your elevated towers. I see we updated the slide since yesterday. This helps you maintain that minimum pressure here in Louisiana of 15 psi. I said 20 yesterday because that's the Texas requirement, and we were corrected by a bunch of people. Said we're allowed to go down to 15 here. Now, this is one that I don't see very often, but I was told that these are still fairly common here in Louisiana, a standpipe. Basically, a standpipe is a cross between an elevated tower and a ground storage tank. It takes the qualities of a ground storage tank, that it sits flat on the ground, it's one size all the way up, but it works on the principle of trying to exert pressure on the system like an elevated tower, in that they're built quite narrow and tall. It's basically a tall pipe sitting full of water on your system. Now, if they're greater than 80.85, basically if it's 81 feet or taller, it's classified as elevated storage. Anything below that is just a really tall ground storage tank. So if you have that requirement of having at least one elevated tower in your system, you can use this as long as you build at least 81 feet tall. You usually see these built in areas where they have higher elevations. Maybe the plant is up higher than the customers. A lot of areas, like particularly in California, around San Francisco, they use this a lot because there they have their terrain is so hilly and your plants are built up in the high parts of town that they very rarely actually have to run booster pumps. They can rely almost exclusively off of their standpipes and elevated towers. When your plant's sitting up, a couple hundred feet higher elevation than your customer, it saves you a lot of money on electricity. But I guess with the price of their real estate out there, they got to make it up somehow. All right, pressure tanks. Right down there in the bottom corner, sitting out in front of the ground storage tank, that horizontal thing that looks like a propane tank, that's what we call a pressure tank. Basically what they are, it's a mixture of air and water inside the tank that's used kind of like a shock absorber on your system. You fill it up partially with water, you top it off with air, that air compresses that water, helps keep a nice even pressure out in your system. Like I said, a lot of systems have gotten away from them, especially your larger systems, because they're very labor intensive. I know for the city of Houston, we've virtually eliminated all of our pressure tanks because they're very prone to leaking air. And unlike a water leak that we're good at finding, an air leak is a whole lot harder to find. Plus you have to have compressors on site, things like that to keep that air, in the tank. On all your storage devices, whether it's a horizontal pressure tank, an elevated tank, a standpipe, ground storage tank, clear well, whatever you want to call it, they all should have annual inspections. I said that yesterday, had a few people laugh, and they said, yeah, in your dreams we have an annual inspection. Now, from state to state, it varies. Some states will allow the municipality or the operating company to do their own inspection, simply submit a report saying, yes, we've checked our tanks, we've looked at everything, everything's good. Other states, such as Texas, they have us check the tank, fill out a form, then they send somebody out to verify it. So I guess them having us check it is just a chance for us to fix anything before they actually come out. Does Louisiana, does your DHH come out and inspect your tanks? Okay, but they don't have a dedicated just inspection of your tanks. Well, that's similar to what we do. They do it during our annual state inspection. They come out, they check everything, but one of the things we have to submit to them in advance of that is we have to do an inspection of all our tanks and give them a checklist. Now, when you're doing these inspections, you're both looking at the interior and exterior. Now, the exterior is a lot easier to inspect. You know, you walk around, look for the condition of the tank, look for condition of the fittings, your coatings, looking for leaks, you know, any visible damage from the outside. Now, when it gets to inspecting the interior of your tank, that can be a whole lot more difficult because generally what do you have to do? You have to take the tank out of service, open it up, go inside. They're usually a lot more lenient on those interior inspections. We generally do ours about every 3 years when the money's available. But what happens if you have a tank where you might only have one tank in your system? Well, you obviously can't shut your system down and tell your customers, well, for the next 3 days, don't take a bath, don't drink any water, don't flush your toilets. What you can actually do is there are companies out there that will come out and drop a camera in there and visually inspect your tank. Or what I actually had done at one of my plants just a couple months ago, we had a scuba diver go in. He went in, you know, while the tank was in service, dropped in the tank, took a camera, videotaped the entire interior. Now, if we had found a problem, then we would have been forced to take the tank out of service. But this way, just for a routine inspection, we're able to find out what's in the tank without actually having to take it out of service. Because this was a result of one of those poor designs we got stuck with. Somebody who had no idea how to run a plant, drew up a plant, and said, hey, instead of taking 2 small tanks, let's just build you 1 big tank. Well, the problem with that is, what happens when that 1 big tank has a problem? Like I said, you're looking to make sure that your tank is meeting all the AWWA standards, plus your state standards, but most states will base their standards off of the AWWA recommendations. You want to check your corrosion protection. That corrosion protection can be your coatings inside, your paint. You know, it could be paint, galvanized. Do you use a lot of galvanized tanks here? Yeah. For a while there, it seemed like people were trying to get away from the galvanized tanks, but I'm starting to see a comeback on them. More and more people are going back to them because they don't have the life expectancy of a steel tank or a concrete tank, but they're a whole lot cheaper. And there's less maintenance during the years you do have it. You put water in it and keep on going. This one got me laughed at yesterday also. We are required to have an ownership sign on all facilities that says the name of the facility, who operates it, the emergency contact number, and we usually put the water system number on it. I was told here, I guess that's not a requirement. Well, even if it's not a requirement, it's probably a good idea, because what happens if, you know, your operator hadn't been by the plant yet and you've got a leak or something? You know, the guy driving down the street sees something overflowing. By having that sign up there telling them what it is, who owns it, who operates, how to get a hold of somebody, you know, they could potentially call in and let you know, hey, you got a problem over at your plant, you need to send somebody. It can also be a double-edged sword. You get that neighbor who now has your number and is mad because they don't like the plant being next door to them. You know, that plant was there when they bought the house, but they're mad that it's there now. Because when they came to look at the house, the well wasn't running. They didn't hear the noise. Now they have to sleep next door to it. They don't like it. Looks like we got somebody with some experience on that. Oh, I started in wastewater. I've had those angry customers come in. You know, plant's been there for 20 years. The customers lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. Didn't know we were there until we had a construction project, and she wanted to know where all these 18-wheelers were going to all of a sudden, and followed one of them into the plant, and then demanded we shut the plant down. Said, well, would you like us to shut the plant down and let the sewer back up into your house? That didn't go over too well. That's probably why I'm not a PR person for the city. Groundskeeping. This has kind of been a pet peeve of mine because one of our former directors, we are one of the largest utilities in the country. One of our directors, in order to decide to save money, came out with a directive, told us, we are in the business of making water, not cutting grass. I am not putting any money out there to cut grass. We'll cut grass whenever somebody complains about it. Well, how does that look when people drive by your plant and you've got 6-foot grass? Or your operator walks out there and he disappears into the field. That's literally how I got them to start cutting the grass at one of my facilities. The grass got so high, I told an operator, go out there and stand in the field. Go stand next to your well. Took a picture of him. All you could see was the top of his head. I sent it downtown. I said, you need to cut this grass before somebody gets bit by a snake or falls and breaks their ankle or something happens to them. Got the grass cut for a little while. You know, people neglect, they don't think about groundskeeping. You know, a lot of what we do is public perception. You know, you're dealing with, people think if they drive by, they see a plant that looks good, they assume the water must be good. Like you said earlier about the water, it's safer now because you're eliminating this disinfection byproducts for them. But that's not what they see. Those DBPs, they can't see that. They're not concerned about, well, that might give me cancer in 20 years. Now, when the media runs a report on it, they'll suddenly be concerned about it. But every time they turn on that tap, all they know is, this water doesn't look very good. It can be perfectly safe. Same thing with your plant. They drive by, they see that your tank is peeling, your grass isn't cut, you know, there's just junk strewn around the yard. They look at that and say, they can't even keep the plant clean. How could they possibly be keeping the water clean? Now, like we talked about earlier, the disinfection is meant as an insurance policy. Once that water's produced, you may have the best water in the world. You may have the most pristine well. You pump it in that tank and it sits there. But if you don't have that residual, you're still subjecting that water to potential contamination. That little bit of chlorine residual or whatever disinfection you use, that provides you that insurance policy to make sure nothing starts growing in that tank while it's sitting there. You know, in addition to that, you want to make sure you choose your locations for your tanks wisely. You know, a lot of times, especially if you're on the operation side, you're usually stuck with whatever you inherited. But as you get stuff built, as you remodel things, try to make an effort to get involved, you know, bring it up to the engineers, bring it up to the people doing the design, making the decisions, the people with the money to say, hey, we shouldn't build this tank here because it's near this. You know, the neighbor's got a septic tank and it drains right towards that where you want to build that tank. A lot of times you're out in the field, you see this stuff, you know, you're dealing with these plants on a daily basis. You know what's out there better than the people doing the design. You know, I've heard of design engineers that, you know, they've been designing plants for 10, 20 years. You take them out to a plant, you show them a tank and they look at it and say, what is that? Well, that's a ground storage tank. Oh yeah, I've designed those before. But they've never actually seen one. During that inspection time, when you're doing your annual inspection, or should be your daily walk around of your plant, any types of cracks or leaks you find, you want to make sure you go ahead and repair them. Because that's creating a potential cross connection, a chance for any kind of contamination that's out there, bacteria, anything that could potentially compromise that water could get in through that crack or leak in that tank. Also, just take general precautions to make sure that you don't get any kind of other contaminants from entering the tank. Like I said, keeping your hatches shut, keep your screens on, you know, keep people out of your facility. You know, because not all contamination is accidental. You know, there's always the potential that somebody, you know, could be a disgruntled employee, somebody who just doesn't know what they're doing, get in there. I actually had, about a year ago, I had a homeless person break into one of my plants and was taking a bath in my overflow. Opened up the overflow and was taking a bath in it. You know, Only reason we caught him is we happened to have a sample collector going out there to take a tank sample. He pulled up and the guy's there in his birthday suit taking a bath. And when he asked him, what are you doing? Taking a bath, just like no big deal. He'd probably been doing it regularly, just happened to get caught this time. Anytime you take your tanks down, anything in your plant for any kind of repair, anything where you might have introduced some contamination. If somebody had to enter that tank, if you had to dewater it for any reason, whether it's a regulation for you or not, it's a good practice. Always disinfect it before it goes back in service. But pretty sure if you look in your regulations, it's going to be there that you should disinfect before going into service. Again, I know for Texas it is, but I don't want to misspeak for Louisiana. All right. Now, once we get outside the plant, how do we get the water to the customers? It all goes through our distribution system. There's a lot of different components to it, including the mains, service lines, your meters, valves, hydrants, pump stations. For a pump station, a lot of people might ask, well, what is a pump station? Well, depending on the size of your system, you may have to take that water, once you pump it out to your customers, you may not be able to pump it far enough to get to your furthest reaches. What some systems have to do is actually take that water, pump it from one plant to another plant or a repump station, put it into another storage tank, and then repressurize it. That way it can reach their far reach customers. For City of Houston, we actually have about 8 of those because the majority of our surface plants, actually all of our surface plants, are on the east side of town. Well, what side of town is growing the most? The west side. They all want to build away from the plants. Well, it's about, our farthest customers are a good 40 plus miles away from some of the plants. Well, no matter how much you pressurize that water, by the time it gets that 40 miles, you got no pressure left. So for a lot of situations, you may have to look at a repump station. Anything you put in your distribution system, anything you do with your water has to meet your standards. Here in Louisiana, you must maintain a minimum 15 PSI in your system at all times. What happens if you go below 15? Boil water notice, right? Boil water notice ever a fun thing to have to deal with? Like we talked about earlier, it's all about perception. They figure, well, if you've screwed this up, what else have you screwed up that you haven't told me about? You can lose a lot of confidence in your customers just by one boil water notice. Yes, sir. No, unfortunately I don't.
It does say it in the code, but I don't know exactly what section.
I'm not sure. I don't know. We had a copy of the sanitary code available yesterday, but I don't think we have one here today.
One at every one of the stations inside your well house or whatever.
You could possibly talk to some of your regional representatives back there. They might be able to. None that I'm aware of. Generally, it's just good practices you want to recommend, you want to follow. Most places, it really varies depending on who you talk to. And again, I'm going back to my personal experience. We've gone through a lot of phases at the City of Houston. At one point, the belief was the higher the pressure, the better, just like chlorine. We all go through that phase where more is better, the bigger the better. We were running, averaging 60, 70 out in our system. And then one day we got a new boss. They said, whoa, why are we wasting all this electricity pumping this water so high? We're going to cut it down to 55. Well, there's benefits and drawbacks to no matter what situation you choose. You get the real high pressure, you're using more electricity, you may potentially cause more breaks depending on your system, especially if you have an older system. Yes, it's usually a lot more expensive. The higher your pressure.
Some places are raising their pressure so they can increase their revenue.
Hadn't thought about that one.
Are you sure that number's right, or is it supposed to be higher than that?
For the minimum,
Louisiana, yes.
15 pounds is
What we have always gone with, if I may, is 20 PSI. And that's usually what the federal government and many, many other states. However, yesterday during the training, we had several people that were adamant Louisiana is 15. And so that's where that number comes from, but you probably looking at other documentation, only is 20 PSI and that's only. Yeah, and it goes back to your controls, what they were saying.
now remember, this 15 is under worst case scenario. You obviously don't want to run your system at a 15 PSI regularly because you're going to start getting a lot of phone calls. People don't like it, especially if you got a customer up on maybe a third floor of a building. You know, we're going through a big problem. Is one of the trends in Houston is they're building these 4-story homes where the first story is a garage and they build 3 stories. Well, the way our building code says, if you're 3 stories or if you're more than 3 stories, you have to have a day tank. They get around it because they say, well, technically that first floor is not a floor, it's a garage. Well, they call us up and say, well, I've got no water pressure on my 4th floor. Do you have a day tank? No. Sorry, can't help you. That doesn't go over very well, but I mean, there's nothing we can do. There's certain areas where even if you're providing them 30 or 40 pounds, by the time it gets up to that top floor, they take a shower on their first floor bathroom and pressure seems great. They've got that 10-pound difference up top. It's really noticeable. Sometimes that low pressure, though, helps us find people doing illegal things. We've had people tell on themselves by doing that before. What we go by as a rule of thumb, normally, well, actually it's a state regulation for us, but it's also what we try to go by is 35 PSI under normal conditions. This 15 or 20, depending on your state regulation, which 15 here is for emergency situations like during extreme drought or during a hurricane, immediately after some sort of a disaster, something where you had to shut some equipment down, or you didn't shut it down but it went down on its own. Like I said, 35 is under normal conditions. 15 is for emergencies.
I guarantee it's 15 pounds as of 4 or 5 years ago, the last time I read it.
Okay.
What, because that's a test question.
Okay. Yeah, I unfortunately I can't tell you exactly where you can find it in the regulations, but that it's been the consensus from everybody we've talked to here in Louisiana that 15 is the minimum here.
It is a state sanitary code.
All right, now once you get out in that distribution system, you know, you're using pipelines to get your water out into your system, and they can vary from, you know, depending on your system, anything from 1-inch pipe up, like I said, we've got some 96-inch pipe. I think we've actually got a very short run of 108-inch pipe right when it comes out of our largest plant. Yeah. They're not fun to work with. 8 inches is the largest you've got in your system?
And most of it's full.
Wow.
We have to have booster station because of the size of the pipe. Pressure up on the other end.
Okay. And a lot of systems in a lot of states have gone to a minimum of 6-inch because of the combined fire systems. Because generally you don't want to put a fire hydrant on anything less than a 6-inch. But like I said, is your system an older system?
It's an old system and it's a small system. It's only 350 meters.
Yeah. Generally, when the smaller you get, the more lenient they get with you because they understand that, you know, you may not have the capital funds to go in and upgrade all your system.
Some of it has concrete asbestos pipe in it still.
Believe it or not, we still have a ton of asbestos concrete pipe in Houston. Now, we don't put it in anymore, but like I said, you know, each of these different types of pipe you've got out there, ductile iron, cast iron, steel, concrete, they all have their pluses and minuses, and they all, you know, usually we go through phases in this industry. For years, back in, I guess it was maybe the late 70s, early 80s, Asbestos concrete was the rage. It was the greatest thing ever. That's all we were putting in the ground. Then the ground started moving. Pipes started snapping left and right. Then all the concerns about asbestos started coming out. Well, what do we do when we have to take this pipe out? You know, you have to do special processes if you have to cut a section of pipe out.
You have to have a certified person do that.
Yep. And again, I apologize for keep bringing up Texas, but what we have to do is they have to actually, it has to be only wet cuts, and they have to cover it in plastic while they're cutting. It's a real pain in the butt to deal with. Yes, sir. I can't hear you.
We have asbestos, cement, pipe, and all that stuff. Is there a requirement to test it every so many years? The water?
Yes, if you refer back to, again, I think it's module 5.7, okay, as well as on your disc, there is asbestos, analysis that must be performed. Now, many systems, especially if they include that 9-year system, not a problem, they're on a 9-year rotation. Are you on a 9-year rotation? So it's either 3, 6 years, every 3 years, every 6 years, every 9 years. That's no federal regulation. Louisiana, you got to know that, but if you go back to East State Drinking Water Act, that's where it's at. And if we have any time at the end, I'll actually pull it up on the list so that we see what time frame it is.
But that's in your book or something?
It's in the book, it's also on the disc. There is a chapter on asbestos, I don't know if there's a chapter on asbestos, but it's on the disc.
As Bessie was saying, there are regulations as far as testing the pipe, but generally what the consensus is, and as with anything, there's no absolutes. Most people agree that as long as the pipe is not compromised, there's no risk of the asbestos getting into the water. Because generally the problem with asbestos is when you cut it or you break it up, the particles, it's the breathing in of the particles that cause the problems. Friable?
When it becomes airborne,
Okay.
once we drink it, it's safe.
I guess I always hear people say, I always thought people were saying flyable.
Fry.
Fryable, like a fish fry. Okay. Now, like I said, just with everything else, it's we go in cycles. What are we at now? PVC pipe. That's what, you know, for most situations, up to about a 30-inch pipe, anything going in the ground in the past 20 years, PVC. Now, will we go through a phase in another 20 years where they'll say that it's causing cancer or it's leaching or there's something? There's probably already talks about it. You know, because just like with the bottled water, now the big concern is the plastic leaching off BPAs? So, now a lot of people say, well, why the PVC? Why do we use that? I got a lot of friends who work in the chemical industry. They don't use PVC. Everything is steel. Everything's welded inside of the plants. Well, why do we do it? Because it's cheap. You beat me to it. It's cheap, it's easy to work with, and it causes less friction. Less friction, less electricity usage. And it's so readily available. You know, just about anybody can put it in the ground. It doesn't require a welder. It doesn't require too many special tools. It's not like cast iron where once you put it in, you try to tap it and it splits open. You know, it's very flexible, it's very workable. Areas like Houston where we have a very shifty soil, our ground shifts a lot. During the summer, our ground shifts so much, especially when it gets dry. 2 years ago, we went through a drought, you know, real bad drought. During that drought, we were averaging 1,200 breaks a day. That was our backlog, not what we were getting reported. That was the backlog on the average day. We went through about 6 months like that. On a good summer, we have a 300 to 400 a day backlog. Now your pipe joints, that's going to depend on what kind of pipe you have. If you're dealing with steel, it's usually going to be a welded. Just about anything else from that, it's going to be a bell and spigot type fitting. Basically, you'll have a male, female end of the pipe with some sort of a gasket in it. The pipes are pushed together. Obviously, the steel is the most resistant to any kind of contamination because it's a solid weld, but it's a lot more expensive, harder to work with. Now, the lead content in this stuff, we just discussed that as of right now, it's 8% you can use, but come December, I believe, it goes to 0.025. Basically, all solder, flux, anything you're using on your joints, basically has to be lead-free after this year. Now, I was told that yesterday that Louisiana is allowing, if you have any of the stuff in stock, they're allowing you to use it up, whatever stock you have, but you cannot purchase any new. Now, don't quote me on that. That's just what somebody told me yesterday in class. So if you have already bought up a bunch of it, you don't have to say, well, I've got $10,000 worth of material sitting on a shelf that I can't do anything with now. Go ahead and use it up. It has to be in the ground before then? Yep,
But the manufacturers have already started making it lead-free, so they're finding now they're already getting.
yeah. As he's saying, most of the manufacturers have already gone to all lead-free. So if you've bought anything recently, it's going to be lead-free anyways. But, you know, if for some reason maybe you bought up a bunch of stock a while back and you've been sitting on it, maybe you got a really good deal at a time, or, you know, somebody's brother-in-law was selling it, so the council bought a ton of it. Now, one of your other components you're going to deal with a lot is your valves. In your distribution system, you're going to have a few different types of valves. Your most common type is your isolation valves. What do those do? They're put out there so if you have to work on a line, you have to make a repair, you need to shut it down for some reason, you don't have to shut your entire system down. You can go to the two nearest valves, shut them down, minimize the number of people you put out of service. Now that's if you can find those valves when you get ready to need them. I was over the valve crew for the city for a long time. I hated it. You know, because every time a contractor does some work, they put in a new sidewalk. They saw that valve was there when they dug up the sidewalk. Think they took the time to make sure they exposed it when they went to put that sidewalk back in? Find them covered up all the time. People walk down the street, they see a valve stack. Oh, there's a place I can throw my garbage. You know, or just over time, you know, dirt gets covered over them, grass grows over them. You know, you put a valve in, hadn't been operated in 20 years, you go to look for it, and now there's a tree growing through it. For this type, your gate valve is your most common type. Everybody here know the difference between a gate valve and a butterfly valve? Anybody not know the difference? Okay, basically a gate valve has a gate that moves up and down. A butterfly valve has a disc in it that turns sideways to shut the flow off and on. Basically, that's the main difference between the two of them. Generally, your gate valves will be used for your smaller applications up to 12-inch, 20-inch. Most of your large diameter valves, 20-inch and up. And again, there's exceptions out there because I've got one 36-inch gate valve in one of my facilities, and we were highly upset that they put it in there because anybody who's ever had to operate a large diameter gate valve knows why we hate it. True. Well, a big problem that we've seen with the butterfly valves is the gaskets in them wear out, and no matter, you can turn it all the way shut and you still have plenty of flow going by, especially when you're dealing with some of the large stuff. You know, you can close a valve and still have a 6-inch flow going by. True, true. Now, from my personal experience, we've had less problems with gate valves than the butterfly valves. But again, it could be depending on the age of your system. Are you working in a fairly old system?
Just saying, most of the time, a lot of times, I would prefer the other, because gate valve, a lot of times, you get somebody that's turning on and don't know which way they're doing or what they're doing, because you get a lot of people, a lot of times, turning off contractors and stuff, and they drop it. You don't know it dropped. Then when you go working on it, it drops.
True, true.
You gotta dig it up and fix it.
Yeah. I mean, each type of valve has their benefits and their drawbacks, but yeah, I mean, we haven't had a real big issue with that in my experience, but I have seen it happen, you know. Usually the problem we see with the gate valves is somebody jams them shut, or if it's a very large one, you have that back pressure against it. You've dewatered one side of the line, you go to open it up, and you've got that pressure pushing against that gate and it won't allow it open. Now, another type of valve that you're going to have are your controlling valves. They can be pressure reducing valves, directional valves like a check valve. You know, you only want your water to go a certain direction. You put a check valve in, water can go one direction. If it tries to go back the other way, it'll force the flap shut. Those are very common inside your plants. In fact, all your booster pumps should have a check valve on them. I'm not sure if it's a requirement here, but if it's not, it should be. Now, this picture up here is depending on the application, the same valve, if it's inside an elevated tower, will be called an altitude valve. You put that same valve out in the distribution system, it's referred to as a pressure reducing valve. So if you hear those two terms, it's the same valve, just depending on the application. It's just kind of like a ground storage tank and a clear well. Same item, same tank, put in two different situations, we call it two different things. Basically all that does is it takes the pressure, you can adjust it and say, I only want 50 pounds to be able to pass through here. You can set it, when you use it in that application, it's referred to as a pressure reducing valve. Now if you want it to not open till a certain pressure, is when you have it as an altitude valve. You also have globe valves, diaphragm valves, rotary valves. These are just all various types of valves you might have. Fire hydrants. This is where the fire department meets the water department. And a lot of times we fight over who that fire hydrant belongs to. Oh yeah, when it comes to fixing it, the fire department, they don't want nothing to do with it then, right? You know, anytime, if it costs money or labor, they don't want nothing to do with it. But other than that, they want to claim that's their piece of equipment. Well, obviously the first purpose of a fire hydrant is for putting out fires. But they also serve an important purpose in our distribution system. They can be used for flushing your lines. They can be used for tracking down problems. You're getting a low residual in your system, or maybe you're getting a color complaint or a taste and odor complaint. Go out on those fire hydrants, you can use those fire hydrants to track down where that problem originates from. Rather than having to go to the customer's house and potentially, you know, be getting a sample of what's wrong with their house, that fire hydrant sits directly on your main, unless you've got a separate fire system. And you can use that to track down where your problem is originating from. You're also, fire hydrant is your best place to do your system flushing. A lot of people will put in, 2-inch blow-offs, or maybe even a 4-inch blow-off. Nothing moves water like a 4-inch on a fire hydrant though. Also, anytime you do a repair, what happens when you open your line? Air gets in it. You dewater that line, you go to put it back in service, suddenly you got air pockets in your system. Again, utilize what's already there. Instead of having to put a blow-off in somewhere, just use what's already out there. Use that fire hydrant. Open it up, allow that air to get out of your system, because what happens when that air gets to the customer's house? You start getting complaints. Either they know it's air and they're just mad that there's air in their line, or what I've seen, they will swear up and down you're putting something in their water. It's dirty. Ask them, well, does it clear from the bottom up or from the top down? Well, it clears from the bottom up. Well, what goes up? Air? No, but this doesn't look like air. There's no way that's air in my water. It's hard to convince people sometimes. Now here's something I found a lot of people aren't familiar with. Automatic flushers. Basically what they are, it's an electronic valve that's put on a fire hydrant or a blow-off somewhere in your system that basically you can program this thing to come on and flush your system at any given time. These are real handy for situations where you might have a low residual area, where you don't have a lot of demand. You can put this out there, and rather than having to send an operator out there and open that fire hydrant once a week or every couple days, you put this auto flusher on, let it run. You can program it to come on at night where people don't see the water usage, because especially when you start talking about raising rates or you're in a drought where you're asking people to restrict water, you still got to get your flushing done. But they don't understand, well, how come I've got to restrict water, but you don't? You put this auto flusher on, you have it come on at night, people never know that it was running. Now there is some people don't like them because they believe they waste too much water. But a lot of times, you got to look at it, it's the cost of doing business. If you want to get good product to your customers, sometimes you got to waste a little bit of it to do it. And usually these are a lot more efficient than you would think. We've used a couple different models that, in my system, and most of them use anywhere from about 40 gallons a minute up to maybe 100 gallons a minute. So if you turn it on for 10 minutes a night and that keeps your problem resolved, 1,000 gallons of water is a low price to pay to save an operator from having to go out there. Like I said, there's several companies out there that offer them for retail, but I'll tell you, they're cheap and easy to build yourself. Anybody's interested, get with me after class. I'll tell you what parts you need to buy. We started buying them from a company, paying a few $1,000s a piece from them, got to looking at what they actually were. It's sprinkler components is all it is. We took the component, went to a sprinkler supply place, bought the same exact component, same brand even that they were using, built them for about $200 a piece. Now, once the water gets out there, gets to the customer, what's our ultimate goal besides providing good water to people? Revenue. Without revenue, where would we be? Now, I understand that there are some of the smaller systems around here that still do flat rates. That's become a very uncommon thing because people want to charge for what they're actually using. Some people say it's to incentivize people using less water, but we know it's just so we want to make as much revenue as possible. Now, in order to do that, we've got meters that if you are charging a usage fee, it's usually based off of your meter readings. You have a meter at each customer. You go out, you get your readings off of it, and you find out how much water they're using, you charge them by the gallon. Like I said, now if you're using a flat rate, then you're still probably going to have meters within your plant, within your system somewhere, because we all have to keep track of the water we're producing for various reasons. Like I said, I know in my system we have a meter on every well, because we still have to account for how much groundwater we're producing. We have what are called subsidence districts. We have to report to them how much water we're pumping out of the ground. So we have to have a meter on every well. So even if we were doing a flat rate, we'd still have some meters in our system. Plus, but we have a very wide variety of customers, and I don't think a flat rate would go over too well for us because we have such a variety of, you've got your single person residents where they might use 1,000 gallons a month. You go in our rich part of town, you got a $40 million house sitting on a bunch of acres with all kinds of flowers, and they're paying $1,000 a month for their water, just for their landscaping water. That guy who's got the 1,000 gallon a month wouldn't be too happy if he had to pay $100 a month for his water bill because he's sharing the cut for the guy watering all his landscape. Plus, a lot of our big industrial customers, they use a significant amount of water that we couldn't, there's no way we could just give them a flat rate. We have one customer, Shell, they pay over $2 million a month for their water. Now the meters there's a few different kinds. You got propeller, compound, magnetic meters. Your propeller meters, that's primarily your small meters like what you would find at a residence. It's got a little disc inside and it spins as the water passes through and it turns a wheel that, just like an odometer on a car. Now your compound meters, they can have two ways of measuring. They measure for high and low flow, where you have a situation where at certain periods it may use a lot of water, but you still want to keep track when they're using, a small amount of water. Like particularly maybe you have an industrial facility where, when they're running they're filling up their cooling tanks, they're using a ton of water at one time. But the rest of the time when they're running the bathrooms, running the kitchen, it's just like a house. And then your magnetic meters, that's your big meters. That's where you're getting your 12-inch, 16-inch meters. Like I said, your propeller meters are positive displacement meters also. Like I said, it's all about income for us. Take a break. Y'all want a break? Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break.